Welcome to the war narrative where wars become stories. The First World War had ended, but Europe was not peaceful at all. The fighting stopped in 1918. But what came next was not calm. It was chaos. Great empires that had seemed impossible to defeat, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Kingdom, and the hundreds of years-old Romanov family rule in Russia, had all fallen within months of each other. Their borders were broken, their governments were gone, and their armies were scattered, leaving empty power across Central and Eastern Europe. Into that empty space came dozens of new nations: Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Finland, the Baltic states, and Poland, brought back to life after 123 years of being divided up. For over a century, Poland had existed only as a memory, carved up between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Now, the dream of freedom was finally real. But dreams built on the ruins of empires were fragile things. The map of Europe in 1919 was like a patchwork quilt made of quick decisions, treaties, and shaky agreements. Borders were unclear, changing from week to week. People were mixed together: Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Jews, Germans, all living in the same towns and areas. And in Moscow, the Bolsheviks had grabbed power after the October Revolution, promising not only to rule Russia but to start a worldwide workers' revolution. The Russian Civil War was still raging, Reds against Whites. But Lenin's government had already started looking westward. Their new Red Army, built during Civil War, was not happy just defending its revolution. It wanted to spread it. To the Bolsheviks, Poland was not just another neighbor. It was a hallway, a gateway. If communism could push through Polish land, it might set fire to the heart of Europe, especially Germany, where trouble still bubbled after losing the Great War. For the Poles, independence was exciting but terrifying. Their nation was back on the map, but surrounded by enemy powers and uncertain friends. They knew that survival would not be guaranteed by treaties signed in Versailles or Riga. It would be tested in the fields, forests, and rivers of Eastern Europe. Poland had waited over a century for its chance to live again, and almost immediately, it faced a fight for its very existence. Poland's rebirth in 1918 was nothing short of amazing. But miracles are never safe. From the moment the nation reappeared on the map, it found itself surrounded by rivals. Germany to the west, angry over losing its eastern lands. A weak but ambitious Lithuania to the north. A crumbling, war-torn Russia to the east. And in the south, the messy remains of Austria-Hungary, with Ukraine caught between collapse and rebirth. Every neighbor saw Poland's weakness as an opportunity, and every border was fought over. At the center of this fragile new state stood one man, Józef Piłsudski, a revolutionary-turned-government leader who carried the weight of his country's survival on his shoulders. For decades, he had dreamed not only of independence but of a Poland strong enough to resist control by East or West. His vision was bold. He imagined a group of nations, a Międzymorze alliance stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, tying together Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and others as a wall against both Germany and Russia. But Piłsudski's vision crashed into reality. Poland was exhausted by war. Its soldiers were brave, but the army itself was a patchwork. Former veterans of 3 different imperial armies, still wearing mismatched uniforms and carrying rifles of every kind. Weapons came from the leftovers of defeated powers or shipments trickling in from other countries. Some battalions had rifles but no bullets. Others had bullets but no rifles. Horses were scarce, vehicles even scarcer. But the danger was not only about materials. Across the border, Bolshevism was spreading like wildfire. In Berlin, Munich, and Budapest, communist uprisings had already flared up. To Piłsudski and many in the West, Poland was not just defending itself. It was defending Europe. If the Bolsheviks broke through, who would stop them from marching all the way to Germany, perhaps even France? Still, Poland's leaders faced their own problems. Should the young nation strike first to secure its borders and carve out space for survival? Or should it hold back, saving strength, hoping the Bolsheviks would be too tangled up in their civil war to threaten Poland directly? These questions haunted Warsaw's halls of power in the winter of 1919. It was a nation reborn, but one living on borrowed time. Every decision felt like a gamble. Every delay risked complete destruction. Poland had survived the 1800s only as a memory in the hearts of its people. Now Piłsudski knew the task was to keep that memory alive in the 1900s. Through sheer will, strategy, and if necessary, blood. Warsaw could debate strategy endlessly. But along the frontier, the reality was already unfolding. The line that separated Poland from Soviet Russia in 1919 was not a solid border. It was a shifting frontier of forests, swamps, and villages where neither side held firm control. Here, war began not with grand announcements but with shadows and whispers. Small groups of Polish soldiers clashed with Bolshevik fighters. Surprise attacks in the woods, sudden gunfire in the night, villages taken one day and lost the next. Nobody knew when the fighting would end or whether they were simply the beginning of something bigger. In many places, local people changed their loyalty depending on which army arrived that morning. For the peasants, survival meant swearing loyalty to whoever held the rifle at their door. The truth is, no one can say for certain when the Polish-Soviet War truly began. Some historians trace it to the first border raids of early 1919. Others argue it started for real only when Piłsudski's forces marched into Belarus and Ukraine. But to the men in the trenches and the civilians caught between, it was less a clear beginning than a slow boil, violence spreading outward until it could no longer be contained. These early months revealed how unsteady both sides were. The Red Army, still locked in a life-or-death struggle with the White forces inside Russia, had little strength to spare. But the Polish forces, though aggressive, lacked the resources to keep fighting endless campaigns. It was a stalemate born of weakness, but it could not last. Each fight carried the risk of getting bigger. Every village taken planted the seed for revenge. And as reports of clashes grew, one truth became undeniable. Poland and Soviet Russia were on a collision course. The spark had been struck. It was only a matter of time before it exploded into a full-scale war. As 1919 wore on, Poland struck boldly. While the Red Army was consumed by its civil war against the Whites, Piłsudski saw opportunity. His young nation might not yet have secure borders, but it had momentum, and momentum was power. In the north, Polish troops pushed forward into former Lithuanian and Belarusian lands, capturing Vilnius and Minsk. In the south, they surged into western Ukraine. To outside observers, it seemed astonishing. A nation that had only just been reborn was now expanding its reach, taking back lands long denied to it. But these victories were less the result of overwhelming strength than of timing. The Bolsheviks were exhausted, stretched thin, their best forces tied down elsewhere. Local populations were weary of chaos and in some cases welcomed the Poles, hoping for stability after years of war. Resistance was scattered and often half-hearted. Still, the sight of Polish flags over Minsk and Vilnius carried powerful symbolism. For many Poles, these were not foreign conquests but restorations of a greater homeland, the dream of a Poland that stretched from the Baltic to the Dnieper. Piłsudski's vision of a federation seemed for a moment within reach. But success carried danger. The farther the Polish troops pushed, the thinner their lines became. Supply wagons rattled over endless muddy roads. Ammunition was scarce, horses dying, men marching in worn-out boots. Victories came cheaply in terms of blood but dearly in terms of endurance. In Warsaw, enthusiasm swelled. Newspapers praised the rapid advances. Politicians spoke of new borders. And for the first time in decades, Poles dared to believe they were shaping history rather than being crushed by it. But to the east, in Moscow, these headlines struck like a challenge. The Bolsheviks, once indifferent to Poland, began to see it as an enemy that could not be ignored. The stage was being set. Poland's daring advance had bought it fame, territory, and hope, but also a dangerous overextension. The line of conquest could not hold forever. And when the Red Army finally turned its full attention westward, Poland would discover just how fragile its victories truly were. If Poland was to survive, Piłsudski knew it could not stand alone. The dream of a federation of nations demanded allies. And to the south, one such partner clung desperately to existence, the Ukrainian People's Republic. Ukraine, caught between empires, had been carved apart during the Great War. The Germans had occupied it. The Whites and Reds had fought over it, and local groups had risen and fallen in quick succession. By 1920, only fragments of the Ukrainian Republic remained, led by Simon Petlura, a man whose armies had been battered to the edge of collapse. Petlura faced an impossible choice. Alone, Ukraine could not resist Bolshevik conquest. But an alliance with Poland, the very power that once claimed Ukrainian lands, risked accusations of betrayal. Yet for Petlura, survival outweighed pride. In April 1920, he signed a pact with Piłsudski. Poland would recognize an independent Ukraine, and in return, Ukraine would fight at Poland's side against the Soviets. It was a marriage of desperation more than trust. Many Ukrainians resented Polish soldiers marching through their towns, fearing a new occupation disguised as liberation. Yet others hoped that, with Polish help, the dream of a free Ukraine might endure. For Piłsudski, the alliance was not just about territory. It was about creating a buffer state between Poland and Russia, the first piece of his envisioned federation. Together, Polish and Ukrainian forces launched an ambitious offensive. Their target was bold Kiev, the historic heart of Ukraine. The campaign symbolized more than strategy. It was meant to proclaim to the world that the East could resist Bolshevism, that nations long trampled under empires could rise again. The partnership, fragile though it was, now carried both nations forward into a campaign that would test not only their armies but their very survival. The joint Polish-Ukrainian offensive moved with startling speed. In late April 1920, Piłsudski's forces crossed into Ukraine, and within days, the Red Army fell back before them. Villages and towns that had seen 3 or 4 different flags in as many years now watched another wave of soldiers marching through. Poles in patched uniforms, Ukrainians wearing whatever could be found from a decade of war. By May 7, 1920, the campaign reached its dramatic high point. Polish troops entered Kiev, the city that had endured German occupation, civil war, and famine now saw foreign soldiers once again parading through its streets. Officially, Piłsudski declared that Poland had come as a liberator, not a conqueror. He spoke of Ukraine's independence, of partnership, of defending the region against Bolshevik tyranny. But the triumph masked deeper problems. The march to Kiev had not been a fast motorized attack but an exhausting trek. Most soldiers walked hundreds of miles, dragging their supplies in carts. Horses were so scarce that artillery was sometimes abandoned simply because it could not be moved. Men marched with blistered feet, their uniforms in tatters, living off the countryside where rations failed to arrive. Once inside Kiev, the reality of occupation set in. Polish and Ukrainian units were spread thin, hundreds of miles from their bases, and with little chance of reinforcements. The city itself was weary, scarred by years of upheaval. Many civilians viewed the new occupiers with suspicion, uncertain if the Poles were liberators, overlords, or simply the latest in a long line of armies to trample their land. For Piłsudski, Kiev was supposed to be a signal to the world. Poland was strong, Ukraine was free, Bolshevism could be contained. Yet beneath the banners and parades, cracks were already showing. The Red Army had not been defeated. It had only pulled back to prepare. And in Moscow, the humiliation of losing Kiev stirred a determination for revenge. The occupation of Kiev was a victory, but one heavy with uncertainty. The Polish lines were overextended, their soldiers exhausted, and their alliance fragile. The question was not whether the Soviets would return. It was when and with what force. In Moscow, the news that Polish troops had paraded through the streets of Kiev struck like a thunderclap. To Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership, this was more than a military setback. It was a humiliation, a direct challenge to their revolution. The Red Army, built in the fires of civil war, could not allow such an insult to stand. At the head of the response stood Leon Trotsky, People's Commissar for War, a man who understood that wars are not won by soldiers alone but by discipline, organization, and ideology. Trotsky rallied his commanders for a counterstrike. Among them was Mikhail Tukhachevsky, a young, ambitious general whose energy and brilliance made him one of the Red Army's rising stars. To the south, another figure loomed, Joseph Stalin, already known for his ruthless determination, though still far from the dictator he would later become. The plan was bold and two-pronged. Tukhachevsky would lead a massive offensive from the north, driving through Belarus and striking directly at Poland's heart. Stalin, supported by the famed 1st Cavalry Army under Semyon Budyonny, would retake Ukraine, smash through Polish defenses, and push westward. Numbers told the story of growing Soviet strength. By summer 1920, the Red Army had swelled to 300,000 men equipped with thousands of machine guns and hundreds of artillery pieces. Against this, Poland could gather only a fraction. Barely 120,000 soldiers stretched thin across a vast and indefensible frontier. What Poland had taken easily, it now had to defend desperately. Its soldiers were scattered, supply lines long and brittle, morale already strained from endless marching. The Soviets, by contrast, were freshly motivated, united not only by orders but by ideology. For many Bolshevik soldiers, this was not just a war for land. It was a war to spread the revolution itself. Kiev had been a symbolic prize for Piłsudski, but to the Bolsheviks it was a challenge they could not ignore. The Red Army was awakening, and when it would move with a force Poland had never before faced. The Red Army struck in the summer of 1920, and the blow was overwhelming. From the north, Tukhachevsky unleashed his offensive with precision and fury. Over 160,000 men supported by more than 700 artillery pieces and nearly 3,000 machine guns surged westward through Belarus. Against them stood Polish divisions, scattered and under-equipped. Their defenses stretched so thin that any weak point could become a fatal breach. To the south, the advance was led by Stalin's forces and the 1st Cavalry Army under Budyonny. Fearless horsemen who seemed like relics of a bygone era yet proved terrifyingly effective in open country. Their cavalry raids slashed through supply lines, cut communications, and struck deep into Ukrainian territory far behind Polish positions. Villages burned, garrisons were surrounded, and panic spread along the front. For the Polish troops, it was a nightmare. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outpaced. Supply shortages grew critical. Units ran low on ammunition, rations, even boots. Soldiers trudged backward under relentless pressure, fighting rearguard actions, knowing that Warsaw lay exposed if the Soviets could not be stopped. And yet the sheer speed of the Soviet advance carried dangers of its own. Tukhachevsky drove his men forward with relentless energy, never allowing them to rest, certain that victory lay just ahead. But the cost was immense. Soldiers dropped from exhaustion, supply carts fell behind, and casualties mounted. His lines stretched longer and thinner with every mile gained. Still, in those first weeks, the Red Army seemed unstoppable. City after city fell, the Polish retreat turning into a desperate flight. By early July, Soviet banners flew deep in Polish territory. The dream that Piłsudski had carried into Kiev, of a secure border and a federation of allies, was collapsing before his eyes. For the Bolsheviks, this was more than revenge. It was the opening act of something far greater, the march to Warsaw and perhaps beyond. While Tukhachevsky's forces thundered through Belarus, the Southern Front became the stage for one of the most remarkable sights of the 20th century, the return of mass cavalry to the battlefield. Leading it was Semyon Budyonny's 1st Cavalry Army. Tens of thousands of horsemen, sabers flashing, charging across the Ukrainian plains as if the Great War's trenches had never existed. To the modern eye, it seemed old-fashioned. After all, the First World War had proven cavalry nearly useless against machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery. But here, in the vast open spaces of Ukraine, Budyonny's men were not relics. They were predators. They moved with frightening speed, cutting behind Polish lines, overrunning supply depots, scattering infantry that had no time to dig trenches. Their most dramatic victory came at Brody in late July 1920, where Budyonny's horsemen swept through Polish defenses and captured the city. In a single stroke, they cut supply routes, destabilized the southern front, and sent shock waves of panic through the Polish command. Civilians fled westward as rumors spread of unstoppable Soviet cavalry bearing down on them. Beside Budyonny marched Joseph Stalin, attached as a political commander. Though not yet the dictator he would become, Stalin already displayed the ruthless instincts that defined his later rule. He argued fiercely with other commanders, demanded resources, and clashed with Moscow's orders when they conflicted with his own ambitions. For Stalin, the campaign in Ukraine was more than a war. It was a chance to prove himself indispensable to the Bolshevik cause. Together, Budyonny's cavalry and Stalin's infantry pushed relentlessly toward Lviv, threatening to drive Poland's southern defenses into collapse. The image of horsemen storming across the steppe captured Bolshevik propaganda, the Red Army as both modern and eternal, carrying the revolution on steel and hoof. But beneath the triumph lay dangerous flaws. The cavalry consumed supplies at an astonishing rate, and Stalin's obsession with Lviv would later create bitter divisions in Soviet strategy. For now, however, the South blazed with victories, and Poland seemed on the brink of being carved apart. For Moscow, the campaign was never meant to end at the Polish border. To the Bolshevik leadership, especially to the ambitious Mikhail Tukhachevsky, Poland was not the goal but the gateway. He believed that once the Red Army reached Warsaw, the working class of Europe would rise to meet them. In his vision, the Soviets would not just take back lost lands but ignite a chain reaction of revolution stretching into Germany, Hungary, even France. And there was reason to think it possible. Just months earlier, communist uprisings had erupted in Berlin and Munich. A Soviet-style government briefly held power in Budapest. Across a continent shattered by the Great War, poverty and hunger left millions desperate for change. Tukhachevsky and his supporters imagined themselves not merely as generals but as the front line of a global transformation. Yet not everyone in Moscow shared his certainty. Lenin himself was torn. He saw in Poland both an extraordinary opportunity and a dangerous gamble. If the Red Army triumphed, the revolution could sweep westward. But if it failed, Bolshevism might be contained, its enemies emboldened. Trotsky and other leaders warned of the risks. Germany might not rise. France and Britain might intervene, and the Red Army, already stretched thin, could collapse under the weight of its own ambitions. Still, the intoxicating idea of carrying the revolution westward prevailed. Soviet propaganda proclaimed the advance as the liberation of workers everywhere. Soldiers were told they were not conquering but freeing Poland from its middle-class government, preparing the way for international solidarity. Tukhachevsky himself was relentless. He drove his armies west at a punishing pace, ignoring exhaustion, convinced that history was in his grasp. To him, Warsaw was not just a capital. It was the spark that would set Europe aflame. But in that very confidence lay the seeds of disaster. The dream of revolution was vast, perhaps too vast for the fragile reality of supply lines, exhausted soldiers, and the grinding weight of logistics. Poland was not yet defeated. And in Warsaw, Piłsudski was preparing a countermove that could shatter the Bolshevik vision before it ever reached Germany. The Red Army's westward surge became a tidal wave. Town after town in Belarus and Poland fell under Tukhachevsky's relentless advance. Soviet banners were raised over cities that only months earlier had celebrated Polish independence. Local populations, weary of endless war, often watched in silence, uncertain if this new power would bring liberation or simply another form of occupation. Polish troops fell back in disorder. Many divisions were shadows of their former selves, battered by weeks of marching and fighting, forced to retreat again and again. Soldiers spoke of fighting not for victory but simply to buy time. Trenches were dug hastily, then abandoned within days. Ammunition dwindled, rifles jammed from overuse, boots wore out until men marched barefoot. Hunger gnawed at the army, and morale sank as comrades fell one by one. Yet Piłsudski refused to surrender to despair. From his headquarters, he looked at the map not as a record of loss but as a puzzle. Every mile the Soviets gained stretched their supply lines thinner. Every rapid advance created gaps in their coordination. Piłsudski understood that the very speed of Tukhachevsky's offensive carried the seeds of its undoing. Meanwhile, in the south, Budyonny's cavalry pressed toward Lviv, and Stalin, stubborn as ever, clung to his own objectives. The lack of coordination between Soviet fronts grew more dangerous with each passing week. Orders were delayed, communications failed, and rivalries between commanders flared. Yet none of this was visible to the Polish civilians who watched the horizon darken with approaching armies. To them, it seemed inevitable that the Soviets would soon arrive at Warsaw's gates. Europe, too, watched anxiously. To the west, Britain and France debated intervention. If Warsaw fell, the Bolsheviks might advance into Germany, where revolutionaries still whispered of uprising. A Polish defeat could trigger a chain reaction across the continent. The fate of Europe seemed tied to the fate of this one besieged capital. And so, as the Red Army thundered closer, Warsaw braced itself. Trenches were dug by citizens, barricades raised in the streets, prayers whispered in churches. The city was not merely preparing for a siege. It was preparing for survival, for the moment when all of Poland's existence would hang on a single battle. By August 1920, Warsaw stood on the edge of catastrophe. The Red Army pressed ever closer, its advance seemingly unstoppable, while the Polish state teetered on collapse. The government debated evacuation. Foreign diplomats prepared to flee. Rumors spread that Piłsudski himself would abandon the capital, though in truth he was determined to stand and fight. Inside the city, a mood of both dread and defiance filled the air. Civilians took up shovels, digging trenches and building barricades. Priests led processions through the streets, blessing soldiers and praying for deliverance. Shops closed, churches filled, and families whispered fears of what Soviet victory might bring. Punishment, executions, the end of independence so recently won. For Piłsudski, the situation was desperate but not hopeless. He studied the Soviet movements, poring over reports, searching for weakness, and he found one. Tukhachevsky's obsession with speed had opened a dangerous gap south of Warsaw, a seam where the Soviet armies failed to connect. It was slender, risky, and invisible to most, but to a commander willing to gamble everything, it offered a chance at salvation. The Poles gathered every reserve they could muster. Students, farmers, factory workers, anyone capable of carrying a rifle was sent to the front. French advisors, including the young officer Charles de Gaulle, offered counsel, though even they doubted the city could be saved. Supplies were meager, artillery limited, but what Warsaw had in abundance was determination. The sense that Poland was not only fighting for itself but for all of Europe grew stronger with each passing day. Newspapers declared that if Warsaw fell, Bolshevism would flood into Germany and beyond. Soldiers, many barely trained, marched to the front with the knowledge that they might not only be defending their homes but shaping the fate of the continent. It was a nation on the brink, staring into the abyss. The Red Army believed victory was within grasp. Poland feared annihilation yet prepared for a last stand. The battle that was coming would decide far more than borders. It would decide whether the fragile order of post-war Europe would survive or whether revolution would sweep it away. The Red Army pressed toward Warsaw with supreme confidence. Tukhachevsky's announcements promised not only victory but the liberation of workers across Europe. His soldiers, though exhausted, believed they were on the verge of history. On August 12, 1920, the first clashes erupted along the Vistula River, the final approach to the Polish capital. Polish defenders fought desperately. Units dug into the eastern bank of the river resisted wave after wave of Soviet attacks. Machine guns rattled from makeshift trenches. Artillery thundered from the city's outskirts. Entire battalions of young volunteers, students, clerks, peasants, stood shoulder to shoulder with veterans, holding their ground against superior numbers. Many fell, but their sacrifice bought time. Across Warsaw, tension was palpable. Church bells rang to call citizens to prayer. Crowds gathered in the streets, whispering that the city's fate would be decided in days, perhaps hours. Diplomats fled, yet ordinary people clung to hope, refusing to abandon their homes. The capital braced itself for siege, expecting Soviet banners to appear on the horizon at any moment. But in the Polish high command, Piłsudski saw something different. While the Soviets hammered against the city's defenses, he identified their fatal flaw, the gap south of Warsaw, where Tukhachevsky's northern thrust had failed to connect with Budyonny's cavalry in the south. That opening was not just a weakness, it was an invitation. Piłsudski devised a daring plan. Instead of waiting passively behind the Vistula, he would gather a strike force, march it south along the river, and drive it straight into the exposed flank of the Soviet army. If successful, the maneuver could cut through the enemy's rear, sever communications, and collapse their offensive. It was a gamble of staggering proportions. If it failed, Warsaw would surely fall, and Poland with it. But if it succeeded, it could transform certain defeat into the unthinkable victory. Thus began what would later be called the miracle on the Vistula. While Soviet armies pressed at the gates, Piłsudski prepared to unleash a counterstrike that would decide the future of Europe. On the morning of August 16, 1920, the Polish counterattack began. Józef Piłsudski himself rode out with his strike force. A modest but determined army gathered from every corner of the Republic. These were not elite divisions. Many were weary veterans pulled from retreat, reinforced by hastily trained recruits. Yet they carried with them something the Soviets lacked: familiar ground beneath their boots and the knowledge that this was the last chance to save their homeland. The Poles moved swiftly through the gap south of Warsaw that Piłsudski had identified. Soviet maps showed the area as secure, but in reality, Tukhachevsky's forces were spread too thin, focused on their push against the capital. When the Polish column struck, they cut like a blade into the Soviet flank. The 16th Soviet Army, caught off guard, crumbled under the sudden assault. Entire regiments were thrown into confusion, some retreating blindly, others surrounded. Communications collapsed, telegraph lines cut, messengers captured, orders lost in the chaos. The Polish maneuver turned what had seemed an unstoppable advance into a rout. Fighting raged across the countryside at Radzymin and Wołomin. Polish infantry clashed with Soviets in brutal close-quarters combat. Machine guns stuttered from farmhouses. Cavalry charges thundered across fields. Artillery boomed over villages. The Soviets, expecting to be at Warsaw's gates, instead found themselves encircled, harried, and driven into disarray. Piłsudski's counterstroke was not merely tactical brilliance. It was audacity. Few commanders would have dared such a gamble with so much at stake. But his gamble paid off. As Polish divisions poured into the Soviet rear, the Red Army's unity shattered. Soldiers abandoned weapons. Supply wagons were left burning. Whole units surrendered in confusion. Within days, the great Bolshevik drive on Warsaw collapsed. What had seemed inevitable, Poland's destruction, was reversed almost overnight. The tide had turned, and Europe witnessed one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in modern warfare. The shock of Piłsudski's counterattack rippled like lightning through the Soviet ranks. What had been an army poised for triumph dissolved into panic and disarray. Entire formations, once thundering confidently toward Warsaw, now scattered in retreat. Soldiers threw away rifles to flee faster. Supply wagons clogged the roads, and desperate units fought each other for space to escape. Tukhachevsky, commanding from far behind the lines, could barely comprehend the scale of the disaster. His orders took days to reach the front, and by the time they did, the situation had already changed. Soviet divisions were collapsing, not from lack of courage but from sheer exhaustion and chaos. What began as a retreat quickly became a rout. The cracks widened under the weight of rivalry and miscommunication. To the south, Stalin, focused on seizing Lviv, ignored calls to send reinforcements toward Warsaw. His stubborn fixation left Tukhachevsky's northern armies isolated. Worse still, one Soviet army group lost all contact with headquarters entirely, cut off from orders, blundering deeper into Poland until it was surrounded and destroyed. The cost was staggering. Over 60,000 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, while tens of thousands more were killed or wounded in the desperate fighting around Warsaw. By contrast, Polish casualties, though heavy, were far fewer. For the first time, it was the Red Army, not the Poles, that found itself reeling. Across Europe, shock turned into awe. Newspapers proclaimed a miracle on the Vistula, marveling that a nation reborn only 2 years earlier had halted the march of Bolshevism. Diplomats who had prepared for Poland's collapse now scrambled to reevaluate their positions. The Red Army, which seemed destined to carry revolution into Germany and beyond, had been stopped cold. But for Poland, the battle was not simply a miracle. It was a lifeline. The capital was saved, the state preserved, and for the first time, the possibility of victory flickered into view. Yet the war was far from over. The Soviets still had powerful armies in the field, and the cavalry of Budyonny, though delayed, remained a threat. The Next stage of the struggle would test Poland once more, on the plains of Galicia. Even as Tukhachevsky's armies reeled from their catastrophic defeat near Warsaw, the southern front still burned with danger. There, Semyon Budyonny's 1st Cavalry Army, tens of thousands of mounted men hardened by years of war, rode westward, convinced they could turn the tide. For weeks, they had been delayed, clashing with Polish forces around Lviv, following Stalin's orders to seize the city instead of linking with Tukhachevsky. Now, too late to save the northern offensive, they charged into Poland's heartland, unaware that the battle for Warsaw had already been lost. Budyonny's men were legendary. Fierce Cossacks, sabers raised high, banners streaming in the wind, charging with cries that echoed across the steppe. To the Bolshevik press, they embodied revolutionary spirit. To terrified villagers, they were a storm of fire and steel. Yet to the Poles who had learned to fight them with rifles, artillery, and determination, they were no longer invincible. The showdown came in late August near the town of Komarów. There, Polish cavalry, outnumbered but resolute, met Budyonny's horsemen in what would become Europe's last great cavalry battle. On open fields, thousands of horses clashed in a whirl of dust and steel. Sabers rang against sabers. Lances splintered, and entire squadrons wheeled and crashed like living waves. Overhead, modernity intruded. Artillery shells thundered into the melee, machine guns cutting swaths through riders. The result was devastating. Encircled and battered, Budyonny's proud cavalry suffered a crushing defeat. Survivors scattered eastward, their aura of invincibility shattered. The romantic image of horsemen deciding the fate of nations died at Komarów, replaced by the grim reality that cavalry alone could not win in the modern age. For Poland, it was more than a battlefield victory. It was a symbolic triumph. Against the odds, they had stood firm against one of the most feared formations of the Red Army and broken it in open combat. With Budyonny's retreat, the southern front collapsed, and for the first time, Poland could breathe without the constant thunder of hooves at its back. The defeat of Tukhachevsky at Warsaw and Budyonny at Komarów transformed the war. For the first time since its rebirth, Poland was no longer fighting for survival. It was dictating the pace of battle. The Red Army, which only weeks earlier had seemed unstoppable, now staggered backward, bleeding men, weapons, and morale. In September 1920, Piłsudski launched a relentless counteroffensive. Polish troops, hardened by their desperate defense, now surged forward with newfound confidence. Villages and towns that had been abandoned in retreat were retaken, their streets echoing with cheers and relief. For peasants who had seen 4 different armies pass through in as many years, the return of Polish banners promised a fragile stability. The Red Army, still immense on paper, was crumbling in reality. Units that had once numbered thousands now marched with only hundreds. Supplies were in tatters. Rifles were abandoned on muddy roads. Horses collapsed in exhaustion. Soviet commanders tried to regroup, but their armies lacked unity. Communications had been shredded during the retreat, and orders arrived too late to matter. Poland pressed its advantage ruthlessly. Each day, Soviet forces were pushed farther east. Prisoners flooded into makeshift camps, and abandoned artillery was hauled away to strengthen the Polish army. For soldiers who only months earlier had marched barefoot and short of ammunition, this reversal felt nothing short of miraculous. Yet Piłsudski remained cautious. He knew that pushing too far risked repeating the mistakes of Kiev. The goal was not to destroy Bolshevism outright, that was impossible, but to force Moscow to the negotiating table from a position of strength. Every mile gained was leverage for the peace Poland desperately needed. By the end of September, the Soviets were retreating. In chaos, their great gamble in Europe shattered. From Warsaw to the farthest edges of the frontier, a single truth was clear: Poland had survived. And now it held the upper hand. By autumn 1920, the Bolshevik dream of marching through Warsaw into Berlin lay in ruins. The Red Army, battered by defeat after defeat, could no longer sustain its advance. With their forces collapsing and their revolution threatened at home, Soviet leaders were forced to negotiate. For Poland, exhausted and bloodied, the chance to end the war was too vital to ignore. On March 18, 1921, the Treaty of Riga was signed. Poland secured significant gains, territory in Belarus, Lithuania, and Ukraine, pushing its borders far to the east. For Piłsudski, it was a bittersweet victory. The federation he had dreamed of never materialized. Instead, Poland held lands filled with diverse populations, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Jews, whose loyalties were divided and whose presence would sow future tension. For the Bolsheviks, Riga was not the end but merely a pause. They accepted the loss not out of resignation but necessity. Their revolution was still fragile, their country still fractured by civil war. In Moscow, Lenin framed the peace as a temporary setback, an armistice before the revolution would one day push west again. Yet in 1921, the world saw the Polish-Soviet War for what it was, a turning point. If Poland had fallen, the Red Army might have carried communism deep into Europe, igniting uprisings in Germany and beyond. Instead, Poland's stand at the Vistula, what came to be called the miracle on the Vistula, halted the spread of revolution at the very gates of the West. But history is rarely merciful. The borders drawn in Riga would last less than 2 decades. In 1939, the storm returned, Germany from the west, the Soviet Union from the east, and Poland was torn apart once again. The sacrifice of 1920 had bought time but not permanence. Even so, the story of Poland's survival against overwhelming odds became legend. It was the tale of a nation reborn, thrust immediately into a struggle for its very existence, and through audacity, courage, and sacrifice, able not only to endure but to change the fate of Europe itself.